Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. The liberal paradox, when freedom and choice destroy each other. An economist named Amartya Sen constructs a paradox about individual liberty and social choice, about whether societies can simultaneously respect individual freedom and satisfy basic welfare criteria. And the paradox goes as follows. Suppose society values individual freedom, values the principle that each person should be decisive over certain personal matters, should have sovereignty over a domain of choices, perhaps what to wear or what to read or how to live, and call this principle minimal liberalism, the requirement that each individual has at least one pair of alternatives where their preference determines social choice. And now suppose society also values Pareto efficiency, values the principle that if everyone prefers outcome A to outcome B, then society should choose A, should not choose an outcome that makes everyone worse off. And Sen proves that these two principles are incompatible, that no social decision procedure can guarantee both minimal liberalism and Pareto efficiency, that respecting individual freedom can conflict with respecting unanimous preferences. And this is the liberal paradox, also called the impossibility of a Paretian liberal, a demonstration that liberal values contain internal tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that respecting individual choice over personal matters can lead to outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And the paradox has generated enormous literature, has sparked debates about the nature of rights, about whether rights are absolute or can be traded, about how to resolve conflicts between liberty and welfare, and the liberal paradox remains one of the most important results in social choice theory, remains a challenge to liberal political philosophy. Imagine a specific example. Two people, call them Prude and Lude, and a book, and Prude prefers that no one read the book, finds it offensive, would be most satisfied if neither reads it. And second best for Prude is if Prude reads it rather than Lude reading it, because at least then Prude can argue against it from first-hand knowledge, and worst for Prude is if Lude reads it while Prude does not. And Lude has opposite preferences, most prefers that Prude read the book, because Lude thinks Prude needs liberalising. Second best for Lude is that Lude reads it, and worst is that neither reads it. And now apply minimal liberalism. Say that Prude should be decisive over whether Prude reads the book, should have the right to choose for themselves, and Lude should be decisive over whether Lude reads the book, and Prude chooses not to read, exercises their right, and Lude chooses to read, exercises their right, and the outcome is Prude does not read and Lude reads, but both prefer the outcome where Prude reads and Lude does not. Both rank that outcome higher, and so the liberal outcome, the outcome that respects individual rights, violates Pareto efficiency, produces an outcome that both prefer to avoid, and the paradox emerges, respecting rights produces an outcome that unanimous preferences reject. The liberal paradox demonstrates that rights and welfare can conflict, that giving individuals control over personal matters can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And this challenges the assumption that liberalism is coherent, that respecting freedom always improves welfare. And Sen's paradox shows that this is false, shows that freedom and welfare can diverge, that societies face trade-offs between respecting rights and respecting preferences, and different resolutions prioritize differently. Some prioritize rights and accept that Pareto improvements may be blocked, accept that unanimous preferences may be overridden by individual sovereignty, and other resolutions prioritize welfare and accept that rights may be violated when everyone would benefit, and neither resolution is fully satisfying. both involve accepting tensions within liberal values. Visualize the paradox as revealing a cycle. Individual rights produce an outcome, unanimous preferences reject that outcome and prefer an alternative. But that alternative violates individual rights, and we are stuck cannot satisfy both rights and preferences simultaneously. And this cycle shows that liberalism contains contradictions, that its commitments can conflict, and resolving the conflict requires prioritizing, requires deciding whether rights or welfare is more fundamental, and different liberal theories answer differently. Rights-based liberalism prioritizes rights and accepts welfare losses. Welfare-based liberalism prioritizes welfare and accepts rights violations, and no theory satisfies both perfectly. One response to the liberal paradox argues that the problem is with the specification of rights, that the rights in Sen's example are meddlesome, are concerned with what others do, and proper rights are self-regarding, are concerned only with what you do, not with what others do. And if rights are limited to self-regarding matters, then the paradox may not arise, then respecting rights may be compatible with Pareto efficiency. And this response requires distinguishing between self-regarding and other-regarding preferences, between preferences about your own life and preferences about others' lives. And liberalism protects the former, but not the latter, and this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of rights, by denying that Prude has a right to prevent Lude from reading, even if Prude prefers that outcome. Another response accepts the paradox, accepts that rights sometimes block Pareto improvements, and argues that this is acceptable, that rights are constraints on social choice, are not mere preferences to be aggregated, but are protections that cannot be violated, even for welfare gains. And this deontological response treats rights as absolute, as trumps over welfare, and accepts that respecting rights may produce outcomes that everyone prefers to avoid. And this response is consistent with rights-based liberalism, with the view that individual freedom is foundational, is not negotiable, and welfare considerations cannot override rights. And the paradox is accepted as showing the cost of rights, showing that freedom has trade-offs. A third response questions the Pareto principle, argues that unanimous preferences should not always be respected, that preference satisfaction is not always good. And in Sen's example, the preferences are meddlesome, are concerned with interfering in others' choices, and perhaps such preferences should not count, should not be given weight in social choice. And this response modifies the Pareto principle to exclude meddlesome preferences, to respect only preferences about self-regarding matters. And this resolves the paradox by restricting the domain of preferences that matter for social choice. And this approach has some support, has intuitive appeal, because it seems wrong to let people's preferences about others' private behaviour determine social outcomes, seems to give too much weight to intolerance or judgment. The liberal paradox also connects to debates about paternalism, about whether societies should prevent people from making choices that harm themselves, and paternalism violates minimal liberalism, overrides individual choice for welfare reasons, and the paradox shows why such overriding might be tempting, shows that respecting choice can produce outcomes that the chooser prefers to avoid. And this creates pressure toward paternalism, toward intervention, but liberalism resists, maintains that individual choice must be respected even when it leads to regret. And the tension between respecting choice and promoting welfare is permanent, is built into liberal theory, and the paradox makes it explicit. Some argue that the liberal paradox is merely theoretical, is unlikely in practice, requires specific preference structures that rarely occur, and empirical investigation of whether such structures exist would be valuable, but regardless of frequency, the paradox is important as a logical possibility, as a demonstration that liberal principles can conflict. And this shows that liberalism requires trade-offs, requires balancing competing values, and political philosophy must grapple with these trade-offs rather than assuming that liberal values are always compatible. The paradox also raises questions about whether societies should recognize rights at all, whether individual sovereignty over personal matters is justified if it can lead to collectively worse outcomes. And consequentialists might use the paradox to argue against rights, to argue that social choice should be based on welfare alone, without constraints from individual rights. But most find this conclusion extreme, find that rights are valuable despite potential conflicts with welfare, and the challenge is to specify rights carefully, to balance rights and welfare, to create institutions that respect both as much as possible while recognizing that perfect compatibility is impossible. Prude and lewd exercise their rights, make their choices, and the outcome satisfies liberal principles but violates Pareto efficiency, and both prefer an alternative, but that alternative requires violating someone's rights, requires overriding someone's choice, and the paradox stands unresolved, showing that liberalism contains tensions, that freedom and welfare can conflict, that rights and preferences can diverge, and the liberal paradox endures as one of the important impossibility results in social choice theory, as a challenge to liberal political philosophy, as a demonstration that liberal values are not perfectly compatible. And the paradox remains a permanent feature of liberal theory, requiring careful navigation, requiring trade-offs between competing values, and showing that coherent liberalism is more complex than it appears. The liar paradox. There exists a statement so simple that it collapses the foundations of truth itself, a sentence that devours its own meaning the moment it is spoken. And this is the liar paradox, a loop that has haunted logicians and philosophers for over 2,000 years. The paradox is most famously expressed in a single declaration: this statement is false, and the mind recoils at what follows. For if the statement is true, then it must be false as it claims. But if it is false, then it must be true because it correctly identifies itself as false. And so the cycle begins again, spiraling endlessly, without resolution, without escape. The ancient Greeks were the first to wrestle with this demon of language, and Epimenides, the Cretan, is often credited with an early version when he declared that all Cretans are liars, which implies that if he himself is a Cretan, then his statement must be a lie, which means Cretans might actually tell the truth, which means his statement might be true, which means it is false again, and the contradiction churns without mercy. Philosophers have spent centuries trying to solve or dissolve the paradox, and some argue that self-referential statements like this are simply meaningless, that language breaks down when it tries to refer to itself in this way, while others suggest that truth is not binary but exists on a spectrum, allowing for statements that are neither fully true nor fully false, hovering in some undefined space between. Bertrand Russell encountered similar contradictions when developing set theory and discovered that self-reference could destroy the entire logical framework of mathematics, leading him to create new systems that carefully excluded paradoxes like the liar from ever forming. The paradox also influenced Kurt Gödel, whose incompleteness theorems proved that within any sufficiently complex logical system, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven, which itself echoes the spirit of the liar paradox, the idea that truth and provability are not always the same thing. Some modern logicians have proposed paraconsistent logics, systems where contradictions can exist without causing the entire structure to collapse, allowing the liar paradox to be true and false simultaneously without forcing us to accept that everything is true, which would render logic useless. Others reject the paradox entirely, claiming that natural language is too vague and imprecise to support rigorous logical analysis, that the liar paradox is a quirk of grammar rather than a deep philosophical problem. Yet the paradox persists, refusing to die, surfacing in new forms, across disciplines, from computer science to legal theory, anywhere that self-reference appears. Consider a sign that reads, "Ignore this sign," or a rule that states there are no rules, or a person who says everything I say is a lie, and the same strange loop emerges, the same dizzying collapse of meaning. The liar paradox forces confrontation with the limits of language, logic, and truth itself, suggesting that reality may not always fit neatly into categories of true and false, that some truths may be inherently unstable, slipping through the fingers the moment they're grasped. It reminds us that words are not perfect mirrors of reality, but tools shaped by human thought. And sometimes those tools turn on themselves, revealing cracks in the structures we build to make sense of existence. The knower paradox. There exists a peculiar sentence that seems to lead directly to contradiction, and this sentence states the knower is not known. And the question arises, is this sentence true or false? And both options lead to trouble, creating what is known as the knower paradox, a puzzle in epistemic logic that reveals tensions between knowledge, truth, and self-reference. Suppose the sentence the knower is not known is true. Then by definition of what the sentence says, the fact that the knower is not known is itself not known. It is a truth that escapes knowledge, but if this is a truth, then it is knowable. There is nothing incoherent about knowing that something is not known. We know many facts of the form. Nobody knows X. We know that nobody knows the exact number of grains of sand on all the Earth's beaches, and so if the knower is not known is true, then someone could know it. But if someone knows it, then they know that the knower is not known, which means the knower, the fact that the knower is not known, is now known. And this contradicts the content of the sentence, which states that this fact is not known. And so assuming the sentence is true leads to contradiction. Suppose instead that the sentence is false, then its negation is true, which means the knower is known, which means someone knows that the knower is not known. But if someone knows this, then the knower, the proposition that the knower is not known, is indeed not known becomes known. And so the sentence is true after all. And again, contradiction emerges. And so neither assuming the sentence is true, nor assuming it is false, leads to a consistent outcome, and the paradox resists resolution through ordinary logical means. The knower paradox is related to the liar paradox and other self-referential semantic paradoxes, but it involves knowledge rather than truth, and it shows that knowledge, like truth, cannot be fully captured within a single, consistent formal system without restrictions, that self-reference combined with epistemic notions generates instability, and the paradox has implications for epistemic logic, the formal study of knowledge and belief, because standard epistemic logics treat knowledge as a modality, a sentential operator that applies to propositions. And these logics typically assume that knowledge is factive. If you know P, then P is true. And that knowledge is transparent. If you know P, then you know that you know P. And these principles, which seem innocuous, interact with self-reference to produce paradoxes like the knower. One response to the knower paradox is to restrict self-reference, to prohibit sentences that refer to their own knowability status, much like Tarski's hierarchy of languages prohibits sentences that refer to their own truth. And on this approach, the knower is not known is not a genuine sentence, not a proposition with a truth value, but a piece of ill-formed language that violates the rules of proper semantic construction. And while this response avoids contradiction, it does so at the cost of limiting what can be said, of ruling out sentences that seem grammatically and conceptually well-formed. And it leaves open the question of why these restrictions should be imposed, whether they reflect genuine features of knowledge or are merely technical devices to preserve consistency. Another response distinguishes between levels of knowledge, perhaps first-order knowledge about the world, second-order knowledge about knowledge, third-order knowledge about knowledge of knowledge, and so on, and argues that the knower paradox conflates these levels, that the knower is not known involves a sentence referring to its own knowability at the same level, and that this is illegitimate, that knowledge statements must be stratified into a hierarchy where knowledge at one level can only apply to propositions at lower levels, and this hierarchical approach mirrors solutions to the liar paradox and other semantic paradoxes, but it raises questions about whether ordinary knowledge attributions respect such hierarchies, whether in natural language we freely mix levels of knowledge without contradiction, and whether imposing hierarchies is a genuine solution or merely a way of avoiding the problem. Some philosophers embrace paraconsistent logic, systems that allow contradictions to exist without trivializing the entire system, without forcing the conclusion that everything is true. And in paraconsistent frameworks, the Noah paradox can be true and false simultaneously. The sentence can be both known and not known, and the contradiction is tolerated rather than resolved, contained within the logical system without spreading. And while this approach is radical, it has the advantage of taking the paradox at face value, of not dismissing it as ill-formed or illegitimate, but recognizing it as revealing something genuine about the limits of consistent reasoning about knowledge. The Noah paradox also connects to issues about the closure of knowledge under known entailment. The principle that if you know P and you know that P entails Q, then you know Q, because this principle, combined with the factivity of knowledge and certain assumptions about self-knowledge, can be used to derive paradoxes, and some epistemologists have questioned whether closure should be unrestricted, whether there are cases where you know P and know that P entails Q but do not know Q, perhaps because Q is a complicated consequence that you have not worked out, or because Q involves self-referential or paradoxical content that resists knowledge. The paradox raises questions about the transparency of knowledge, the principle that if you know P then you know that you know P, because this principle, known as the KK principle, is controversial. Some argue that it is too strong, that there are cases where you know something without knowing that you know it, perhaps because you're not introspectively aware of your knowledge, or because the recognition of knowledge requires second-order reflection that you have not performed. And if the KK principle is rejected, then some versions of the Noah paradox may be blocked because the reasoning depends on assumptions about what is knowable given what is known. The Noah paradox sits alongside other epistemic paradoxes, the surprise examination paradox, Fitch's paradox, Moore's paradox, each revealing different tensions in our concepts of knowledge and belief, each challenging the assumption that these concepts can be fully formalized without residue, and together they suggest that knowledge is a more complex and less tractable notion than it appears, that self-reference and knowledge do not mix well, that there are limits to what can be known or consistently said about knowledge, and that the project of epistemic logic, while valuable, must navigate carefully around paradoxes that threaten its foundations. The sentence "the knower is not known" hangs in conceptual space, neither comfortably true nor comfortably false, a knot that logic cannot untie, a puzzle that resists the tools we use to solve puzzles, and it reminds us that language and thought contain traps, that self-reference is dangerous, that some sentences generate contradictions not because they are meaningless, but because they expose the limits of our logical systems, the boundaries where consistency breaks down and paradox takes over, and the Noah paradox remains, a thorn in the side of epistemic logic, a challenge to anyone who claims to understand what knowledge is and how it operates. And the question persists, is the knower known or unknown? And the answer, whatever it is, leads to contradiction, and the paradox endures, unresolved and perhaps unresolvable, a permanent fixture in the landscape of philosophical puzzles, a reminder that even knowledge itself, the concept at the heart of epistemology, contains mysteries that philosophy has not yet fathomed. The inverted spectrum problem. What if your red looks like my blue? Two people stand before a ripe tomato, and both say the tomato is red. Both use the word correctly. Both learned colour terms in the same way, by being shown red objects and hearing the word red, and their colour vision is normal. Their eyes and brains function identically, and yet the question arises, do they see the same colour? Does the tomato produce the same subjective experience in both? Or could it be that what one person experiences as red, the other experiences as blue? That their colour experiences are inverted, their spectrums reversed, and yet because they learned language the same way, because red things produce the same relative patterns, they both call the same things red, and have no way of discovering that their experiences differ. And this is the inverted spectrum problem, a thought experiment that has troubled philosophers since Locke, a puzzle about whether subjective experiences are private, whether they could differ between people in ways that behavioural and physical evidence cannot detect, and whether such differences would matter, whether they would mean anything if they are undetectable in principle. Imagine spectrum inversion more precisely. Person A sees red things as having the experience that person B has when seeing blue things, and person A sees blue things as having the experience person B has when seeing red, and this inversion is systematic, extends across the entire spectrum. Green is inverted with purple, orange with indigo, and so on. And both people learned colour words by associating them with the experiences they actually have. So person A learned to call things red that produce the blue experience, and person B learned to call things red that produce the red experience, and their language use is identical, their behaviour indistinguishable, and the inversion is undetectable from the outside, cannot be discovered through any behavioural test, through any physical measurement, through any scientific investigation, because all the objective facts are the same, only the subjective experiences differ. The inverted spectrum problem raises questions about the privacy of qualia, about whether subjective experiences are essentially first personal, accessible only to the person having them, and if spectrum inversion is possible, then qualia are private, are not reducible to anything public or objective, because two people with inverted spectrums have different qualia despite having identical physical states and identical behaviours. And this challenges functionalism, challenges the view that mental states are defined by their functional roles, by their patterns of causes and effects, because inverted spectrums have the same functional roles but different experiential qualities, and so functional role does not determine qualia, does not exhaust the nature of conscious experience. Visualize the problem as a question about the relationship between physical processes and subjective experience. The same physical processes, the same wavelengths of light, the same retinal responses, the same neural firings produce different experiences in inverted people, red experience versus blue experience. And this suggests that experience is not determined by physical processes alone, that there is something additional, something that could vary even when physical processes are fixed. And this something is what philosophers call qualia, the intrinsic experiential qualities of mental states. The what, it is likeness, and the inverted spectrum problem shows, or claims to show, that qualia are real, are distinct from physical and functional properties, are private and subjective. One response to the inverted spectrum problem denies that spectrum inversion is possible, argues that colour experiences are tied to their functional roles, to how they affect behaviour and other mental states, and systematic inversion would require inverting all these connections, would require changing not just colour experiences, but all the associations and reactions and emotions connected to colours. And once all these changes are made, the supposedly inverted person no longer has genuinely inverted experiences, but has the same experiences in a different functional network. And genuine inversion, preserving all functional roles while changing only qualia, is impossible, is incoherent, and the thought experiment fails because it describes an impossible scenario. Another response accepts that spectrum inversion is possible, but argues that it does not threaten functionalism or physicalism, because if inversion is undetectable in principle, then it is not a real difference, not a difference that matters, and science is concerned with objective differences, with differences that make a difference to behavior or physical processes, and subjective differences that have no objective manifestation, are not the kind of things science needs to explain, are not part of the natural world that science investigates. And so, the inverted spectrum problem, even if it shows that qualia are private, does not show that they are non-physical, only that they are aspects of physical states that science does not need to characterize in its theories. A third response appeals to the ecological theory of perception, argues that colour experiences are not arbitrary inner states, but are shaped by the environment, by what colours signify, by their natural and biological meanings. And red looks the way it does because of its associations with blood, fire, ripe fruit, danger, and these associations are grounded in evolutionary history, in universal human experiences, and systematic inversion would disrupt these associations, would make red look restful and blue look alarming, and this would be detectable, would affect behaviour, and so genuine spectrum inversion, preserving all functional roles, including emotional and associative roles, is impossible. The inverted spectrum problem also connects to the problem of other minds, because if spectrum inversion is possible, then we cannot know what other people experience, cannot know whether their red is our red or our blue. And this creates a kind of skepticism, a recognition that subjective experience is essentially private, is not fully accessible to others, and while we can know what people say about their experiences, what behaviours they exhibit, we cannot know what they actually feel, what their experiences are like from the inside. And this privacy is both troubling and profound, suggests that each person's consciousness is a private world, knowable fully only to themselves. Some philosophers argue that the inverted spectrum problem trades on confusion about the nature of colour experience, that colours are not simple intrinsic qualities, but are defined by their relationships to other colours, to contexts, to perceptual constancies, and that inverting these relationships is not coherent, not a genuine possibility, and that the thought experiment misleads us by treating colours as if they were simple atoms of experience that could be swapped without affecting anything else, when in fact colour experience is holistic, is embedded in networks of perception and cognition, and cannot be varied independently. Others embrace the inverted spectrum problem, argue that it reveals important truths about consciousness, that qualia are real, are private, are not reducible to functional or physical properties, and that any theory of consciousness must accommodate this, must allow for the possibility that physically and functionally identical beings could differ in their subjective experiences. And this supports property dualism, supports the view that phenomenal properties are additional to physical properties, are aspects of reality that physical science cannot capture. The two people stand before the tomato, both calling it red, and the question lingers: do they see the same thing? Do their experiences match? Or does one see what the other would call blue? And there is no way to tell, no test that reveals the truth, and the privacy of experience persists. The possibility that our inner worlds differ in ways we cannot communicate, in ways language cannot capture, and the inverted spectrum problem remains, not solved, not refuted, not accepted, but persistent as a challenge to theories of mind, as a thought experiment that probes the nature of subjective experience, as a question about whether qualia are private, whether consciousness has aspects that resist objective description, and whether the inner life of another person is truly accessible or forever hidden behind the veil of their behaviour and their words. And the tomato remains red, called red by both, but whether they see the same red, whether their experiences converge or diverge behind the labels, remains uncertain, remains one of the enduring mysteries about the nature of consciousness and the privacy of subjective experience. The is-ought problem: why facts cannot tell us what to do. Science describes the world, tells us what is, what exists, how things work, the laws of nature, the facts about atoms and organisms and stars, and these descriptions are supported by evidence, by observation and experiment, and they are objective, true or false, regardless of what anyone thinks or wants. And ethics prescribes action, tells us what ought to be, what we should do, what goals to pursue, how to treat others. And these prescriptions are normative, involve value and obligation. And the question that has haunted philosophy since David Hume raised it in 1739 is whether we can derive aught from is, whether we can move from factual premises to moral conclusions, whether what exists tells us anything about what should exist. And Hume's answer was no. There is a gap, an unbridgeable chasm between descriptions and prescriptions, between facts and values, between is and ought, and no amount of purely factual information can tell us what we should do. And this is the is-ought problem, sometimes called Hume's guillotine, because it cuts moral reasoning off from empirical inquiry, separates facts from values, and leaves us wondering how moral knowledge is possible if it cannot be derived from facts about the world. Hume observed that writers on morality begin with ordinary observations, with statements about human nature or God or social arrangements, statements that use the copula is, describing what exists, and then suddenly they switch to statements using ought or ought not, prescribing actions or condemning behaviours. And this transition, Hume says, is never explained, is never justified. The writers seem to assume that the ought follows from the is, that because things are a certain way we should act in a certain way, but this assumption is invalid. The ought does not follow. There is a logical gap, and any argument that moves from is to ought is either invalid or contains a hidden normative premise that was smuggled in. And if all moral arguments ultimately rest on normative premises that cannot be derived from facts, then moral reasoning is fundamentally different from empirical reasoning, is based on values or sentiments or intuitions that are not themselves factual claims. Visualize an argument that tries to derive ought from is. Suppose someone says humans are naturally cooperative. This is a factual claim about human psychology, and then concludes, therefore, we ought to cooperate, a normative claim about how we should behave. And Hume's challenge is to explain how the conclusion follows from the premise, what licenses the move from description to prescription, and the argument seems to assume that what is natural is good, that we should act in accordance with our nature. But this assumption is itself a normative claim, a hidden ought premise, and if we make it explicit, the argument becomes humans are naturally cooperative, and we ought to act according to our nature. Therefore we ought to cooperate. And now the argument is valid, but it rests on a normative premise, the claim that we ought to act according to our nature. And this premise cannot be derived from facts about what human nature is. It is a value judgment, an ought claim, and so the original argument either was invalid or contained a hidden normative premise. And either way, the is-ought gap remains. The ought was not derived purely from is. The same problem arises for any attempt to ground morality in facts. If someone says actions that maximize happiness are good because happiness is what everyone wants, the argument moves from the fact that people desire happiness to the normative claim that happiness is good, and this move assumes that what people desire is good. Another hidden normative premise, or if someone says we should obey God's commands because God created us, the argument moves from the fact of creation to the obligation to obey, and this assumes that we ought to obey our Creator. Another normative premise, and in every case the derivation fails unless a normative premise is included, and if normative premises cannot themselves be derived from facts, then the ultimate foundation of ethics is non-factual, is based on values or intuitions or conventions that are not grounded in empirical reality. The is-ought problem creates a dilemma for moral philosophy. Either accept that moral claims are not factual, are not true or false in the way scientific claims are, but express attitudes or prescribe actions or reflect cultural conventions, and this leads to non-cognitivism or relativism, views that deny objective moral truth, or accept that moral claims are factual, but insist that moral facts are sui generis, are not reducible to natural facts, are known through intuition or reason rather than through empirical observation, and this leads to non-naturalism, the view that morality is objective but not part of the natural world, studied by science, or find some way to bridge the is-ought gap, to derive ought from is, and this requires showing that certain facts entail normative conclusions, that the gap is not as wide as Hume thought, and various philosophers have attempted this, have proposed that the gap can be crossed under certain conditions. One attempt to bridge the gap involves institutional facts, facts about social practices and their constitutive rules. John Searle argued that if you accept a role within an institution, you accept the obligations that come with it. If you are a chess player, you ought to move the bishop diagonally, not because of an additional normative premise, but because that is what it means to be playing chess. The ought is built into the description of the institution, and similarly, if you make a promise, you create an obligation. You ought to keep the promise, and this ought follows from the fact of promising, from the institution of promising and its rules, and Searle claims this shows that ought can be derived from is, that institutional facts bridge the gap. But critics respond that this only works if you already accept the institution, already grant that you ought to follow its rules, and so the normative premise is still there, hidden in the acceptance of the institution. Another attempt involves functional facts. Facts about what things are for. Philippa Foot and others argue that living things have natural functions. Hearts are for pumping blood, eyes are for seeing, and organisms can be evaluated by how well they fulfill their functions. A good heart pumps blood efficiently, a defective heart does not, and humans have functions too, and virtues are traits that enable humans to flourish, to live well, and so we ought to develop virtues, and this ought to follows from facts about human nature and human flourishing. But critics respond that this assumes flourishing is good, assumes that we ought to pursue the goals set by our nature, and these assumptions are normative, are not themselves derived from facts about what human nature is, and so the gap remains. Visualize the gap as a chasm. On one side stand all the facts, all the truths about how the world is, what exists, how things behave, and on the other side stand all the norms, all the truths about what ought to be, what we should do, what goals are worth pursuing, and Hume's claim is that no bridge connects the two sides, that you cannot start with facts alone and reach the norms, that any path from one side to the other requires a leap, requires introducing a normative premise that is not itself factual, and this chasm separates science from ethics, separates empirical inquiry from moral philosophy, and raises the question of how we can have moral knowledge if morality is not grounded in facts. The is-ought problem has implications for moral realism, for the claim that moral truths exist objectively, because if moral truths cannot be derived from natural facts, then what are they? How do we know them? And moral realists divide into naturalists who deny the gap and claim that moral facts are natural facts, and non-naturalists who accept the gap and claim that moral facts are sui generis, are known through intuition or reason, and both positions face challenges. Naturalists must explain how to bridge the gap, must show how ought follows from is, and non-naturalists must explain how we perceive non-natural moral facts, how these facts relate to natural facts, and whether morality can play any causal or explanatory role if it is separate from nature. The problem also affects applied ethics, because if we cannot derive ought from is then scientific information alone cannot tell us what to do, cannot settle moral questions. A doctor knowing all the medical facts about a patient still needs normative principles to decide whether to continue treatment or allow death. An economist knowing all the facts about wealth distribution still needs values to decide whether inequality is unjust. And science can inform these decisions, can tell us the consequences of different actions, but it cannot by itself tell us what we ought to do, what outcomes we ought to pursue. And this means ethics is ineliminable, is not reducible to any empirical science, requires normative reflection and judgment that goes beyond factual knowledge. The chasm yawns, facts on one side, values on the other, and no bridge appears and Hume's guillotine falls. Severing is from ought, description from prescription, and the is-ought problem remains, unsolved, persistent, dividing metaethics into camps, challenging moral realism, questioning whether science can answer moral questions, and forcing recognition that normativity is distinct, that ought is not reducible to is, that values are not facts, or if they are facts, they are strange facts, facts that cannot be derived from ordinary empirical observations, and the problem endures as one of the central puzzles in philosophy, a reminder that ethics is autonomous, that moral reasoning requires more than empirical knowledge, and that the relationship between what is and what ought to be remains one of the deepest and most difficult questions we face. The hard problem of consciousness: why brain activity does not explain experience. A neuroscientist maps every neuron in the visual cortex, traces every connection, measures every firing pattern, understands completely the physical processes that occur when someone sees the color red, knows which wavelengths of light activate which photoreceptors, which signals travel along which pathways, which brain regions respond, and the scientist can predict with perfect accuracy when someone will report seeing red, can manipulate brain states to produce the experience, has complete knowledge of the physical mechanisms. And yet philosopher David Chalmers asks a question that this knowledge does not answer. Why is there something it is like to see red? Why does the physical processing produce a subjective experience, a quale, a feeling of redness that exists from the inside, from the first-person perspective? And this question is the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of explaining why and how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, to phenomenal consciousness, to the felt quality of mental states. And Chalmers distinguishes this from the easy problems, which are merely difficult scientific questions about how the brain processes information, how it integrates data, how it produces behavior. And while these easy problems are challenging, they are tractable, are problems science can solve through normal methods. But the hard problem is different, is a question of a different kind. Asks not how consciousness functions, but why it exists at all. Why there is subjective experience accompanying physical processes rather than those processes occurring without any inner experience, without anything it is like to undergo them. Imagine a zombie, a philosophical zombie, a creature that is physically identical to a human being, molecule for molecule, neuron for neuron, that behaves exactly like a human, says the same things, acts the same ways, but has no inner experience, no consciousness, is dark inside. And Chalmers argues that such a zombie is conceivable, is logically possible. And if zombies are possible, then consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, because the zombie has all the physical processes but lacks consciousness. And so consciousness must be something additional, something over and above the physical. And this is why the hard problem is hard, because it seems to require explaining how something non-physical, something subjective, emerges from something physical, something objective. And no amount of knowledge about brain function, about neural mechanisms, about information processing, seems to bridge this gap, seems to explain why there is something it is like rather than nothing. Visualize the explanatory gap. On one side is all the physical information, all the facts about brain states and neural firing and chemical processes, and on the other side is subjective experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the taste of coffee, and the gap between these two sides seems unbridgeable. Seems like knowledge of one does not give knowledge of the other. And no matter how much we learn about brains, we do not seem to get closer to explaining why brains produce consciousness, why certain physical systems have inner lives. And this gap is what makes the hard problem hard, what makes consciousness seem mysterious, what makes it resist scientific explanation. The hard problem has generated multiple responses, materialists who deny that there is a hard problem, who argue that consciousness is reducible to physical processes, that once we fully understand the brain, we will understand consciousness, that the appearance of a gap is due to our current ignorance, and dualists who accept the hard problem and argue that consciousness is non-physical, is a separate substance or property that exists alongside the physical, and Mysterians who accept the hard problem but argue that it is unsolvable, that human cognitive capacities are limited, that we may never understand how consciousness arises from physical processes because our minds are not equipped to grasp the answer. One materialist response appeals to functionalism, argues that consciousness is not a separate thing, but is identical to certain functional roles, certain patterns of information processing, and what it is like to see red is just the functional role that seeing red plays in the cognitive system, the way it affects memory and behavior and other mental states. And this functional role can be fully captured physically, can be explained in terms of brain processes, and so there is no explanatory gap, no hard problem, only a conceptual confusion that disappears once we realize that consciousness is function and function is physical. Another materialist response appeals to eliminativism, argues that our ordinary concepts of consciousness are confused, are based on folk psychology that science will replace. And when neuroscience matures, we will abandon talk of subjective experience, we'll recognize that what we called consciousness was really just neural processes misdescribed, and the hard problem will dissolve, because the phenomenon it concerns, subjective experience as we currently conceive it, does not exist, and this radical response rejects the starting point of the hard problem, rejects that there is anything subjective that needs explaining. Dualist responses accept that consciousness is irreducibly subjective, is not reducible to physical processes, and argue for property dualism, where consciousness is a non-physical property that physical systems can have, or substance dualism, where consciousness is a separate mental substance that interacts with the physical body. And these views face the interaction problem, the question of how non-physical consciousness can affect physical processes, how mental causation works, and dualists have proposed various answers, some appealing to fundamental psychophysical laws, others denying that consciousness has causal power, but none has achieved consensus. Mysterian responses associated with Colin McGinn accept that the hard problem is real, but argue that it is unsolvable by humans, that our cognitive architecture is not suited to understanding how consciousness arises from matter. Just as rats cannot understand quantum mechanics, humans cannot understand consciousness. And this is not a failure of science, but a limit of human cognition. And we should accept this limit, recognize that some questions are beyond us, and the hard problem is one of them. The hard problem also connects to the knowledge argument. To Mary, the colour scientist who knows all physical facts about colour but has never seen colour, and when she finally sees red for the first time, she learns something new, learns what red looks like, and this suggests that physical knowledge does not exhaust knowledge about consciousness, that there are facts about subjective experience that are not physical facts, and this supports the view that consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, that the hard problem is real. The neuroscientist continues mapping neurons, continues discovering mechanisms, and the scientific progress is real, is impressive, reveals extraordinary complexity in how brains process information. But the hard problem remains, the question of why this processing feels like anything, why there is an inner light, why we are not zombies, and Chalmers's challenge persists, unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, a permanent limit on scientific explanation, or perhaps a confusion that will dissolve with better understanding. And philosophers and scientists continue to debate, continue to propose theories, continue to argue about whether consciousness is physical or non-physical, reducible or irreducible, explicable or mysterious, and the hard problem endures as one of the central problems in philosophy of mind, a problem that touches on the nature of reality, on the relationship between mind and matter, on what we are and what it means to be conscious. And the problem remains hard, stubbornly resistant to solution, a gap that knowledge does not seem to close, an explanatory challenge that persists despite centuries of reflection and decades of neuroscience, and consciousness continues to feel mysterious, continues to seem like something that physics cannot capture. And the hard problem stands as a monument to this mystery, a permanent reminder that subjective experience, the felt quality of mental life, resists reduction to objective physical processes. And whether this resistance reflects a genuine metaphysical divide, or merely our current conceptual limitations, remains one of philosophy's deepest and most difficult questions. The growing argument suggests objects change size over time. A child grows into an adult, a sapling becomes a tree, a pebble is worn smooth by erosion, and yet we say these are the same entities, the same person, the same tree, the same stone. But if size and shape change, can identity truly remain? And this is the growing argument, sometimes called the growing block paradox, or the problem of material constitution. A puzzle about how objects can gain or lose parts while remaining numerically identical to themselves. Consider a statue made of clay, and a sculptor adds more clay to it, making it larger, and then removes some clay, making it smaller. And at each moment, the statue is made of different material, occupying a different volume, and yet we call it the same statue throughout the process. But if the statue is identical to the lump of clay that constitutes it, then the statue and the clay should share all their properties. Yet the statue has properties the clay does not. The statue has aesthetic value. The statue was created at a certain time. The statue could survive minor alterations, while the clay, as a mere lump, has none of these properties. And so the statue and the clay cannot be identical, even though they occupy the same space and are made of the same material. The paradox deepens when we consider the career of the clay. The lump existed before the statue was formed, and will exist after the statue is destroyed, and so the lump and the statue have different temporal boundaries. They begin and end at different times, and if they are not identical, then there must be two objects occupying the same space at the same time, the lump and the statue. And this seems strange, an unnecessary multiplication of entities. Some philosophers embrace this conclusion, arguing that the world contains far more objects than we ordinarily recognize, that every statue is accompanied by a lump, every organism by a mass of cells, every table by a quantity of wood, and that identity is highly context-sensitive, determined by how we carve up the world conceptually rather than by objective metaphysical facts. Others reject this view, arguing that the statue and the lump are the same object considered under different descriptions, that the properties that seem different are not intrinsic properties but extrinsic or relational ones, that being a statue is a matter of how the lump is shaped and how it is regarded rather than being a separate object. The growing argument also applies to living organisms. Because a person gains and loses atoms constantly, the body grows from infancy to adulthood, shrinks in old age, yet personal identity persists. And the question arises whether the person is identical to the collection of matter that makes up their body at any given moment. And if not, then what are they? And if so, then how can they survive the replacement of that matter over time? Mereology, the study of parts and wholes, offers various theories to address these puzzles. Some argue that objects are identical if they share all the same parts at the same time, while others allow for gradual replacement, saying that identity can be maintained as long as the changes are continuous and not too drastic. And still others embrace temporal parts, arguing that objects are four-dimensional, with different temporal slices, and that the question of identity over time is really a question of whether those slices are connected in the right way. The growing argument forces confrontation with the question of what objects are, whether they are material lumps, patterns, processes, or conventional designations. Whether identity is absolute or relative, whether the world contains discrete, persistent entities, or only a flux of matter temporarily arranged in stable configurations, and whether our language and concepts, which treat objects as enduring individuals, accurately reflect the structure of reality or impose a simplifying grid on something far more fluid and complex. The paradox remains unresolved, a source of ongoing debate in metaphysics, and it reminds us that growth and change, the most ordinary features of existence, conceal profound mysteries about identity, persistence, and the nature of the things that populate our world. The Fermi paradox. Where is everybody in this crowded universe? The Milky Way galaxy contains hundreds of billions of stars, many with planets, and our galaxy is one of hundreds of billions of galaxies in the observable universe. And Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago, relatively late in cosmic history, and life emerged within 1 billion years, and intelligence and technology developed recently. And these facts suggest that Earth is not special, that the conditions that led to life here should occur elsewhere, and if even a tiny fraction of planets develop intelligent civilizations, and if even a small percentage of those civilizations develop technology capable of space travel or interstellar communication, then the galaxy should be teeming with evidence of alien intelligence. We should see their radio signals, their spacecraft, their structures, their influence on stars and planets, and yet we see nothing, hear nothing, find no evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence despite decades of searching, despite scanning the skies with radio telescopes, despite analysing thousands of exoplanets. And this silence, this absence of evidence, is the Fermi paradox, named after physicist Enrico Fermi, who reportedly asked during a lunch conversation in 1950, "Where is everybody?" And this question, simple and childlike, conceals one of the deepest puzzles in science, the question of whether we are alone in the universe, or whether alien civilizations exist but remain undetected for reasons we do not yet understand. The paradox can be stated more precisely through the Drake equation, an attempt to estimate the number of communicating civilizations in our galaxy. The equation multiplies together several factors: the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the number of habitable planets per star system, the fraction of habitable planets where life emerges, the fraction of life-bearing planets where intelligence evolves, the fraction of intelligent species that develop technology, and the lifetime of technological civilizations. And depending on the values assigned to these factors, the equation predicts anywhere from 0 civilizations besides us to millions, and optimistic estimates suggest thousands or millions of alien civilizations should exist in our galaxy alone. And over billions of years, some of these civilizations should have spread through the galaxy, colonizing stars, building structures, leaving traces, and yet we see nothing. And this gap between expectation and observation is the Fermi paradox. Various explanations have been proposed, grouped into several categories. One possibility is that intelligent life is extraordinarily rare, that one or more factors in the Drake equation is much smaller than optimistic estimates suggest. Perhaps the emergence of life is a rare event. Perhaps the evolution of complex multicellular organisms requires unlikely coincidences. Perhaps intelligence is not an inevitable outcome of evolution, but a fluke that happened once on Earth and nowhere else. And if intelligence is sufficiently rare, then perhaps we are the first or among the first civilizations in the galaxy, and the silence is explained by our being early arrivals, alone for now, but perhaps not forever. Another category of explanations invokes the Great Filter, a hypothetical barrier that prevents civilizations from reaching the stage where they are detectable across interstellar distances. And the filter could be in our past, something that makes the emergence of intelligence extremely difficult, in which case humanity has passed the filter and the future is open, or the filter could be in our future, a challenge that civilizations face and almost always fail. Perhaps self-destruction, through war or environmental collapse, perhaps technological stagnation, perhaps a transition that seems likely but proves fatal. And if the great filter lies ahead, then our survival is not guaranteed, and the silence of the cosmos is ominous, a warning that intelligence tends toward extinction. A third category suggests that civilizations exist but remain undetected for various reasons. Perhaps they communicate using technologies we have not discovered. Perhaps they deliberately hide to avoid contact with younger civilizations. Perhaps they exist in forms we would not recognize as life or intelligence. Perhaps they transcend physical form and migrate into cyberspace or other dimensions. Or perhaps the distances and timescales involved are so vast that civilizations exist but are separated by millions of light years and billions of years, arising and falling in isolation, never overlapping in space and time, and so contact is impossible. Not because civilizations do not exist, but because the universe is too big and time is too long. Visualize the galaxy as a vast ocean and civilizations as islands, separated by light years of empty space, and each island has a brief window of technological activity, a few thousand years perhaps, before collapse or transformation, and the ocean is so large and the windows so brief that the probability of two civilizations existing simultaneously within communication range is vanishingly small. And so each civilization looks out, sees emptiness, hears silence, and concludes it is alone. And yet across the galaxy and across time many such civilizations exist, but they never meet, never communicate, never know each other, and the Fermi paradox is resolved not by the absence of life, but by the impossibility of contact. Another explanation, more speculative, suggests that we are living in a simulation, that the observable universe is a computational construct created by an advanced civilization, and the silence is programmed. No other civilizations are simulated because the creators are interested only in studying us, or because simulating multiple civilizations is too computationally expensive. And this explanation, while unfalsifiable, is logically possible and provides a clean resolution to the paradox, though it raises new questions about the nature of the simulators and their purposes. The Fermi paradox has practical implications for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, for SETI programs that scan the skies for radio signals, for astrobiology missions that search for life on Mars or the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and for the question of whether humanity should attempt to contact alien civilizations or remain silent. Because if the great filter lies ahead, if civilizations typically self-destruct or face existential dangers, then advertising our presence might be risky, might attract attention from hostile or indifferent intelligences, and the silence of the cosmos might be a survival strategy, a lesson learned by civilizations that survive, and if so, then broadcasting our existence might be foolish, might mark us for extinction or exploitation. The paradox also touches on philosophy and the meaning of human existence, because if we are alone, if no other intelligence exists anywhere in the observable universe, then humanity carries a unique responsibility. We are the universe's only way of understanding itself, the only conscious observers, the only beings capable of science and art and love, and the future of consciousness depends on us, on whether we survive and spread. And this realization, far from being comforting, is terrifying, because it places an enormous burden on a species that has barely begun to leave its home planet. And if we fail, if we destroy ourselves, the universe returns to darkness, to unconsciousness, to a vast emptiness where stars burn and galaxies collide. But no one watches, no one cares, no one knows. The stars shine silent and distant, and we listen, and we hear nothing, and the silence stretches across billions of light years, across billions of years, and Fermi's question echoes, where is everybody? Where are the aliens? Where are the civilizations that should exist, that must exist, that the numbers say should exist, and the answer does not come. And the paradox remains unresolved, pressing, urgent, a question that haunts astronomers and philosophers, a mystery that drives the search for life beyond Earth, and a reminder that despite all our knowledge, despite all our telescopes and equations, we do not know whether we are alone or whether the universe teems with life. And the silence, profound and unbroken, waits, and we wonder and we search, and the paradox persists. The infinite shadow paradox, when your shadow could cover the universe. Imagine standing in a bright room with a light source behind you, casting your shadow on the wall in front of you, and the shadow is roughly your size, perhaps slightly larger, depending on the distance between you and the light. And now imagine moving the light farther and farther away, keeping it directly behind you. And as the light moves back, your shadow grows larger, stretching taller and wider on the wall, because the light rays diverge more gradually, creating a bigger shadow. And if you continue this process, moving the light farther and farther away, your shadow continues to grow. And now the question emerges, what happens if the light source is infinitely far away? If the light comes from an infinite distance, does your shadow become infinitely large? Does it stretch across the entire wall, the entire room, the entire planet, the entire universe? And if so, what does this mean? How can your finite body cast an infinite shadow? And this is the infinite shadow paradox, a thought experiment that reveals tensions between geometry, infinity, and the behavior of light. Consider the geometry more carefully. When the light is close behind you, the light rays that graze the top of your head and the light rays that graze your feet diverge at a large angle, creating a shadow that is only slightly larger than your body. But as the light moves farther away, the angle between these rays decreases. The rays become more nearly parallel, and the shadow grows proportionally. And in the limiting case where the light is infinitely far away, the rays become perfectly parallel, and the shadow, if it still makes sense to talk about a shadow, is no longer a finite shape on a surface, but an infinite column of darkness extending forever in the direction away from the light. And your body blocks a certain solid angle of light, a cone of rays, and when the light is infinitely far away, this cone becomes a cylinder, extending infinitely. And so, in some sense, your shadow has become infinite. It covers an infinite region of space. But there is something strange about this conclusion, because in reality, when light comes from very far away, like sunlight which travels from the sun 93 million miles distant, shadows are sharp and well-defined, not infinite. And the reason is that even though the sun is very far away, it is not infinitely far. And more importantly, the sun is not a point source. It is an extended object, a sphere, and light comes from every point on the sun's surface. And these different light sources create slightly different shadows that overlap. And the overlapping softens the edges and prevents the shadow from extending infinitely. And so the paradox relies on an idealization, a perfectly point-like light source at infinite distance. And this idealization does not correspond to physical reality. And so the infinite shadow is a feature of the idealized model rather than a genuine physical phenomenon. Another way to resolve the paradox is to recognize that the concept of a shadow depends on there being a surface on which the shadow is cast, a wall or a floor or the ground. And if the light is infinitely far away and there is no surface, then there is no shadow in the usual sense. There is a region of space from which light is blocked, but without a surface to project onto. The notion of shadow loses its meaning, and so the infinite shadow is not a shadow at all, but an abstract geometric construction, a cylinder of blocked light extending through space. And whether this deserves to be called a shadow or an infinitely large shadow is a matter of definition rather than a physical fact. The paradox also connects to questions about parallel lines and perspective, because in ordinary experience, parallel lines appear to converge at a vanishing point on the horizon. Train tracks appear to meet in the distance, even though they remain the same distance apart. And this convergence is a feature of perspective, of how our eyes or cameras project three-dimensional space onto two-dimensional images. But in the case of light rays coming from infinity, the rays are truly parallel, not merely appearing parallel, and parallel lines by definition never meet, extend forever without intersecting. And so the shadow, defined as the region blocked by your body from these parallel rays, is a cylinder that extends infinitely. And there is no convergence, no finite boundary. And the paradox is that this seems to make your small body relevant to arbitrarily distant regions of space, seems to give your finite physical presence infinite geometric reach. Some philosophers have used the infinite shadow paradox to argue about the nature of infinity and the limits of physical realizability, suggesting that infinite quantities like infinite distance or infinite extension cannot actually occur in the physical universe, that they are useful mathematical idealizations, but not genuine features of reality. And the paradox supports this view by showing that infinite idealizations lead to strange consequences that do not match experience. And so perhaps infinity is a tool for calculation rather than a description of the actual world. And the paradox is avoided by rejecting the premise that light can come from infinite distance, or that shadows can extend infinitely. Others embrace the paradox as revealing something genuine about geometry and light, accepting that in an idealized geometric setting, with a point source at infinity and parallel rays, shadows do become infinite. And this is not a contradiction, but a feature of how geometry works, and the fact that physical light sources are extended and finite distances are never truly infinite means that the paradox does not apply to real shadows, but it remains a valid thought experiment about what would happen in an idealized limit. And such thought experiments are valuable for understanding the structure of space and the behavior of light, even if they do not correspond to observable phenomena. Visualize yourself standing on an infinite flat plane, with a point of light infinitely far behind you, and the light rays come in perfectly parallel, and your body blocks a cylinder of these rays, and the cylinder extends forward forever. And if there were a wall anywhere in front of you, no matter how far away, your shadow would appear on that wall, and the shadow would be exactly your size, exactly your shape, because the parallel rays preserve size and shape. And so, in this sense, your shadow is not infinitely large, but infinitely long. It is a finite cross-section extended through infinite space. And whether this counts as an infinite shadow or merely an infinitely extended shadow is a question of terminology. But the strangeness remains, the fact that your finite body has infinite geometric influence. The paradox also appears in discussions of cosmology and the nature of the universe, because if the universe is infinite in spatial extent and light travels in straight lines, then in principle, a light source on one side of the universe could cast shadows of objects on the other side, and the time required for light to travel such distances would be infinite. And so the shadow would never actually form, would always be in the process of propagating, and this raises questions about whether infinite distances are meaningful, whether light travelling forever without reaching a destination is different from light that does not exist, and whether geometric constructions that invoke infinity are useful descriptions or merely mathematical artifacts. The shadow stretches forward, grows as the light recedes, and in the limit becomes infinite, a column of darkness extending without end, and you stand there, finite and small, casting a shadow that reaches to infinity. And the paradox asks whether this makes sense, whether infinite shadows are possible, whether geometry allows such things. And the answer depends on what idealizations are accepted, on whether point sources and infinite distances and perfect parallel rays are admitted. And if they are, then the shadow is infinite, and if they are not, then the paradox dissolves. And the paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how infinity changes things, how limits can produce strange results, how geometric reasoning applied to idealized cases can lead to conclusions that violate intuition, and the shadow persists, stretching toward infinity, a monument to the strangeness of geometric idealizations and the care required when reasoning about the infinite. The McGurk effect: why seeing changes what you hear. A person watches a video of someone speaking, sees their lips move, hears sounds, and perceives speech, but something strange occurs. The auditory signal says one thing, the syllable "bah," and the visual signal shows lips making a different movement, the movement for "ga," and yet what the person hears is neither "ba" nor "ga," but "da," a fusion of the two inputs, a compromise between hearing and vision. And this is the McGurk effect, discovered by psychologist Harry McGurk in 1976, a robust illusion showing that speech perception is multimodal, integrates auditory and visual information, and vision can alter what you hear, can change the perceived phoneme, even though the auditory input remains constant and the effect is automatic, is unconscious, occurs even when you know it is happening, and closing your eyes restores the original "bar" sound, showing that vision was modifying auditory perception. And the McGurk effect reveals that perception is not modality specific, but is multimodal, that different senses interact, that seeing influences hearing and hearing influences seeing, and perception is a unified process that integrates information from multiple sources. And this has implications for theories of perception, for understanding consciousness, and for recognizing that sensory modalities are not separate channels, but are interconnected systems that jointly construct perceptual experience. Imagine experiencing the effect, watching a video where someone's lips move saying "ga" while the audio plays "ba," and you hear "da," not what was said, not what the lips showed, but a fusion, and you know the audio is "ba." Can check by closing your eyes, but when your eyes are open, you hear "da." Vision overrides audition, changes what you hear, and the effect is involuntary, is not something you can turn off. Perception integrates the inputs automatically, and this integration occurs before consciousness, before you become aware of the sound, and what reaches awareness is already a fusion, already combines hearing and seeing, and you cannot access the separate inputs, cannot hear "bay" and see "gay" separately, but only experience the integrated "da." The McGurk effect demonstrates that speech perception is not purely auditory, not simply a matter of processing sound waves, but involves visual information about lip movements, facial gestures, speaker identity, and context. And the brain combines these sources, weighs them according to reliability, and produces a unified percept. And when visual and auditory information conflict, the brain compromises, produces a perception that splits the difference. And this compromise shows that perception is not just input-driven but is constructed, is the result of unconscious inference, of combining cues according to probabilities. And McGurk is an example where the inference goes wrong, produces a percept that does not match either input perfectly, but represents the brain's best guess given conflicting information. Visualize the perceptual system as Bayesian, as computing probabilities based on sensory inputs and prior expectations. And when you see lips saying "gya" and hear "br," the brain computes that "die" is most likely given that visual and auditory cues are both somewhat unreliable and the percept should compromise between them. And this Bayesian integration explains many perceptual phenomena, explains how the brain combines cues from different senses, weights them by reliability, and produces unified, coherent experience. And the McGurk effect is a case where the integration produces an incorrect result, but reveals the normal processing that usually works well, that usually integrates senses accurately. The McGurk effect challenges theories that treat senses as separate, that analyze vision separately from audition, that assume perception is modality specific, and the effect shows that modalities interact. That perception is fundamentally multimodal, and this has led to theories of multisensory integration, to research on how the brain combines information from different senses, where in the brain this integration occurs, and what rules govern it, and the McGurk effect has become a paradigm case, a standard demonstration of multimodal perception used in countless psychology classes and research studies. The effect also has implications for understanding consciousness, because the fusion occurs before consciousness, occurs in processing that we do not have access to, and what we experience as the result of this processing is the fused percept, and we do not experience the separate auditory and visual inputs, do not have access to the processing that combined them, and consciousness receives only the output, only the unified percept, and this shows that much of perception is unconscious, is hidden from awareness, and conscious experience is constructed from unconscious processing, and the construction is so seamless that we do not notice it, do not realize that our experience is a synthesis rather than a direct recording of input. The McGurk effect appears in discussions of cognitive penetrability, because if perception is modular, if sensory systems are encapsulated, then one modality should not influence another. Vision should not alter what you hear, but the McGurk effect shows cross-modal influence, shows that perception is not strictly modular, that different sensory modules communicate and interact. And this qualifies strong modularity, suggests that while early sensory processing may be modular, later perceptual processing integrates across modalities, and perception as a whole is not modular but is interactive. And the McGurk effect is evidence for this interactivity, for perceptual systems that are not strictly separated but are interconnected. The effect also has practical implications for understanding speech perception in noisy environments, for designing hearing aids that take advantage of visual information, for developing virtual reality systems that create convincing multimodal experiences, and for understanding how perception can be manipulated, how illusions can be created through conflicting sensory cues. And the McGurk effect shows that perception is vulnerable to these manipulations, is not simply determined by physical input, but depends on how inputs are integrated. The person watches the video, hears da, knows the audio says ba, sees the lips say ga, and yet perceives da, a fusion that is none of the inputs but is the brain's compromise. And the McGurk effect persists, demonstrates multimodal integration, challenges modular theories, reveals unconscious perceptual processing, and stands as one of the most famous demonstrations in cognitive psychology. A simple effect that reveals deep truths about how perception works, how senses interact, how consciousness is constructed from unconscious processes, and the effect remains robust and automatic, a permanent feature of human speech perception, showing that seeing changes, hearing, that perception is unified, that the brain constructs experience from multiple sources, and the fusion continues. Da heard when ba was spoken, and ga was seen, and the McGurk effect endures. The manipulation argument, when being programmed feels like choosing. A scientist creates a person in a laboratory, designs their brain molecule by molecule, programs their psychology precisely, installs specific beliefs, desires, values, personality traits, and then releases this person into the world, and the person deliberates about what to do, weighs options, considers consequences, makes decisions based on their reasons, their desires, their values, and all of this psychological processing feels normal from the inside, feels like genuine deliberation, genuine choice, and yet the person's entire psychology was determined by the scientist, was programmed, and so the person's choices are not really their own, not really free, are the scientist's choices implemented through the person's brain, and the person is not responsible for actions that flow from programmed psychology, is more like a puppet than an agent. And this is the manipulation argument against compatibilism, the argument that being determined by natural causes, by genes and environment, is relevantly similar to being determined by manipulation, by programming, and if programmed persons lack free will, then naturally determined persons also lack free will. And since determinism says all persons are naturally determined, all persons lack free will if determinism is true, and compatibilism is false. And this manipulation argument, developed by Dirk Peerboom and others, creates a serious challenge for compatibilist theories. Forces compatibilists to explain how natural determination differs from manipulation, how being caused by evolution and upbringing differs from being caused by a neuroscientist. And the argument remains controversial, remains debated, and compatibilists offer various responses. But the challenge persists. Imagine the manipulated person situation. They wake up in the laboratory, memories implanted, personality formed, and they go about their life, make choices, pursue goals, and from their perspective, everything seems normal. They feel like they are choosing freely, feel like their decisions are their own, and yet every thought, every desire, every value was installed by the scientist. And nothing about their psychology is random. Nothing escaped the scientist's control. And now consider whether this person is morally responsible for their actions, whether they deserve praise or blame. And the intuition is no. They are not responsible because their actions flow from programmed psychology, from values and desires they did not choose, that were imposed on them. And responsibility requires that psychology be one's own, not be externally determined. And the manipulated person's psychology is not their own, is the scientist's creation. And so they lack responsibility, lack free will. The manipulation argument proceeds through cases, starts with extreme manipulation, obvious programming, and then gradually moves toward more natural cases, and asks at each stage whether the person is responsible, and the cases are designed to show that there is no relevant difference between manipulation and natural causation, that if manipulation undermines responsibility, then natural determination also undermines responsibility. And the four-case argument, Peerboom's version, goes as follows. In case 1, a person is directly manipulated by scientists who induce specific mental states. In case 2, a person is programmed from birth by scientists who arrange their environment and training. In case 3, a person is determined by their genetic, inheritance, and upbringing without any intentional manipulation. In case 4, a person is determined by the normal causal processes of a deterministic universe. And Peerboom argues that there is no morally relevant difference between these cases, that if case 1 undermines responsibility, then so do the others. And since case 4 is just determinism, determinism undermines responsibility, and compatibilism is false. Visualize the progression, from direct neural manipulation to genetic engineering to natural upbringing to deterministic causation. And at each stage, the person's psychology is caused by factors beyond their control, factors they did not choose. And the manipulation argument says that the source of causation, whether intentional or natural, does not matter for responsibility. What matters is that the person's psychology was determined by factors beyond their control. And this determination undermines freedom regardless of whether a scientist or nature did the determining. And if we agree that the manipulated person, in case 1, is not responsible, then we must agree that naturally determined persons, in case 4, are also not responsible, and compatibilism, which says determinism is compatible with responsibility, is refuted. Compatibilists respond to the manipulation argument with various strategies. One response distinguishes between manipulation and natural determination, argues that manipulation involves bypassing the person's normal, deliberative processes, involves imposing psychology externally, while natural determination involves the person's psychology developing through normal processes, through learning and experience and interaction with the world. And this difference matters for responsibility, makes naturally determined persons responsible, even though manipulated persons are not. And the manipulation argument fails because it ignores this difference, treats all determination as equivalent when it is not. Another compatibilist response argues that the manipulated person is responsible challenges the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility. And this response requires biting the bullet, accepting that even persons whose psychology was programmed by scientists are responsible as long as their actions flow from their own deliberation, their own reasons, even if those reasons were installed. And this response preserves compatibilism by denying that manipulation undermines responsibility, by insisting that what matters for responsibility is not the origin of psychology, but its current functional organization. And if the person deliberates and acts on their deliberations, then they are responsible, regardless of how their psychology came to be. A third compatibilist response distinguishes between historical and structural accounts of responsibility, argues that responsibility depends on the structure of the person's psychology, on whether they have the right kind of control mechanisms, the right kind of reflective capacities, not on the history of how that psychology was formed and manipulated. Persons can have the right structure, even if their history is abnormal, and so they are responsible. And the manipulation argument fails because it assumes that history matters when only structure matters. And compatibilism is preserved by adopting a structural rather than historical account of responsibility. Incompatibilists defend the manipulation argument, defend the intuition that manipulation undermines responsibility, and argue that compatibilist responses are ad hoc, are motivated by a desire to save compatibilism rather than by principled distinctions, and there is no relevant difference between being determined by a scientist and being determined by genes and environment. Both involve the person's psychology being shaped by factors beyond their control. Both undermine the kind of control required for responsibility, and the manipulation argument succeeds in showing that compatibilism is false, that determination, whether by manipulation or by nature, is inconsistent with freedom. The manipulation argument also raises questions about what responsibility requires, about whether responsibility is historical, depends on how psychology was formed, or structural, depends only on current organization, and this debate is central to understanding free will, to clarifying what kind of control is required for moral responsibility, and the manipulation argument forces this debate into the open, makes it explicit. And even if the argument does not definitively refute compatibilism, it succeeds in challenging compatibilists to articulate their view clearly, to explain what distinguishes responsible from non-responsible agents. The programmed person walks through life, choosing, deliberating, acting, and feeling free. And the question remains whether they are genuinely responsible, whether their choices are truly their own, or whether they are puppets, implementations of the scientist's design. And the manipulation argument uses this person to challenge compatibilism, to question whether natural determination is really different from artificial manipulation, and the argument persists as one of the most powerful challenges to compatibilist theories. A challenge that highlights the difference between feeling free and being free, between subjective experience of choice and objective reality of determination. And the manipulated person remains choosing but programmed, free-feeling but determined. And whether such a person is responsible remains contested. And the manipulation argument endures as a permanent challenge to compatibilism, forcing recognition that if determinism is true, then we are all in a sense manipulated, determined by factors beyond our control, and whether this determination undermines responsibility, whether it makes us unfree, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will. The ladder paradox: how moving objects shrink and fit where they shouldn't. A ladder 10 meters long rushes toward a garage that is only 8 meters deep. The garage has a front door and a back door, both initially open, and the ladder is traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, fast enough that length contraction becomes important. And according to special relativity objects moving at high speed contract along their direction of motion, and an observer standing in the garage watching the ladder approach calculates that at 80% of light speed, the ladder contracts to 6 meters, shorter than the garage, and so the observer plans to trap the ladder inside by simultaneously closing both doors for a brief moment, catching the entire contracted ladder inside the 8-meter garage. And this seems straightforward. The moving ladder fits because it is contracted, but now consider the perspective of someone riding on the ladder. In their reference frame, the ladder is at rest and maintains its full 10-meter length, while the garage is moving toward them at 80% of light speed, and so the garage contracts to less than 5 meters deep, far too small to contain the 10-meter ladder, and the person on the ladder knows that the front of the ladder will exit the back door before the back of the ladder enters the front door, and trapping the ladder inside is impossible, and so the two observers disagree about whether the ladder fits inside the garage, whether both doors can be closed simultaneously with the ladder inside. And this is the ladder paradox, also called the barn pole paradox, a puzzle about how length contraction and simultaneity interact in special relativity. The resolution lies in understanding that simultaneity is relative, that events which are simultaneous in one reference frame are not simultaneous in another, and the garage observer sees both doors closing at the same time, trapping the ladder, but the ladder observer sees the doors closing at different times. The front door closes first, then the back door closes later, and in the ladder frame, the sequence of events is as follows. The front of the ladder, still 10 meters away from the back of the ladder, enters the contracted garage and immediately exits the back door, and only after the entire ladder has passed through the garage does the back door close, followed by the front door closing, and so in the ladder frame, the ladder never fits entirely inside the garage. It is always longer than the garage, but the doors are never closed simultaneously with the ladder inside, and this removes the contradiction. Both observers agree on the physical facts. They agree on when collisions occur, on whether the ladder gets scratched or damaged, but they disagree about which events are simultaneous, about the order in which certain events happen, and this disagreement is not a matter of illusion or observation delay, but a fundamental feature of space-time in special relativity. Imagine space-time diagrams for both perspectives. In the garage frame, the diagram shows the two doors as vertical lines fixed in position, and the ladder as a diagonal streak moving horizontally through space and vertically through time. And the ladder is shortened by length contraction, and there is a moment when the back of the ladder has entered the front door and the front of the ladder has not yet exited the back door, and at this moment both doors can be closed simultaneously, trapping the contracted ladder. And in the ladder frame, the diagram shows the ladder as two vertical lines, the front and back of the ladder stationary, and the garage as a moving object, contracted along the direction of motion, and the two doors close at different times. First, the front door closes and then opens, allowing the front of the ladder to pass, and then the back door closes after the back of the ladder has already entered, and the doors are never simultaneously closed around the ladder, and both descriptions are correct. Both are consistent with the laws of physics, and the apparent contradiction arises only from expecting that simultaneous in one frame means simultaneous in all frames, and relativity denies this. Simultaneity is frame dependent. The paradox also highlights the role of signals and information, because if the closing of the doors is controlled by signals sent at the speed of light, then the relativity of simultaneity ensures that the signals arrive at different times in different frames, and the physical mechanism that closes the doors respects causality and relativity, and no contradiction arises. The doors can be set to close when the ladder is inside, as measured in the garage frame, and this same mechanism, viewed from the ladder frame, closes the doors at different times, and the ladder is never trapped because it never fits entirely inside, and both descriptions are correct and consistent. Some people find this resolution unsatisfying. It seems like the ladder either fits or does not fit. There should be an objective fact of the matter, but relativity says that fits inside is not an objective notion. When motion is involved, it depends on what simultaneity convention is used, on which reference frame is chosen, and different frames can disagree about spatial relationships without any frame being wrong. And this is one of the deepest lessons of relativity, that spatial and temporal relationships are frame-dependent, that there is no absolute space or absolute time, and that what counts as simultaneous or as fitting inside depends on the observer's state of motion. The ladder paradox has practical analogues in particle physics, where particles travelling at relativistic speeds appear contracted in the laboratory frame. And this contraction affects how they interact with detectors, how they traverse magnetic fields, and how their collisions are modelled. And physicists routinely account for length contraction and time dilation in analysing experiments. And the paradoxical features of relativity are not mere thought experiments, but daily realities in accelerator laboratories. Visualise the ladder streaking toward the garage, its atoms compressed along the direction of motion. The electromagnetic forces between atoms adjusted by the motion, creating a physically shorter object in the garage frame, and the garage rushing toward the ladder in the ladder frame, compressed to a narrow slit, and the ladder threading through this slit without ever being contained. And both pictures are correct, both are consistent, and the paradox dissolves once simultaneity is properly understood, once it is accepted that different observers experience different orderings of spatially separated events, and the ladder paradox remains a teaching tool, an illustration of how length contraction and relativity of simultaneity work together, how apparent contradictions in relativity are resolved by careful analysis of reference frames, and how our intuitions about space and time, trained on low-speed everyday experience, fail completely when speeds approach that of light, and the ladder passes through, contracted or not, trapped or not, depending on who you ask, depending on what frame you occupy, and the paradox endures as a reminder that space and time are not what they seem. That motion affects not just how we measure things, but what length and simultaneity mean, and that Einstein's revolution was not just about equations, but about reconceiving the very fabric of reality. The omnipotence paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it? A theologian proclaims that God is omnipotent, all-powerful, able to do anything, and this claim is central to many religious traditions. Reflects the idea that God is unlimited, unconstrained, the ultimate being with ultimate power, and yet a simple question reveals a logical puzzle, a challenge to the coherence of omnipotence. And the question asks whether God can create a rock so heavy that God cannot lift it. And this question seems innocent, but it creates a dilemma. Because if God can create such a rock, then there is something God cannot do, namely, lift the rock. And so God is not omnipotent. And if God cannot create such a rock, then again, there is something God cannot do, namely, create the unliftable rock. And so again, God is not omnipotent. And either way, omnipotence seems impossible, seems self-contradictory, and this is the omnipotence paradox, also called the stone paradox, a puzzle that has troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries, forcing them to clarify what omnipotence means, what powers an all-powerful being could and could not have, and whether the concept of omnipotence is even coherent. Imagine the scenario concretely. God stands in a cosmic workshop, materials at hand, ready to create, and God decides to make a rock, but not just any rock, a rock so massive, so heavy, so immovable that even God's infinite power cannot lift it, and God sets to work, shaping matter, compressing mass, until the rock is complete, and then God tries to lift it, and the rock does not budge. God pulls and pushes and exerts all divine force, but the rock remains on the ground, unliftable. And this seems to show that God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot do, cannot lift this particular rock. And yet if God never creates the rock, if God admits that creating such a rock is impossible, then this also shows God is not omnipotent, because there is something God cannot create. And the paradox presents a forced choice. Neither option preserves omnipotence. and the concept seems to collapse under its own logic. The paradox can be generalized beyond rocks. The question could be whether God can create a task so difficult that God cannot complete it, whether God can create a being so powerful that God cannot control it, whether God can make a rule so binding that God cannot break it, and in each case the same structure emerges. Either God can create the limiting thing, in which case God is limited by it, or God cannot create it, in which case God is limited by the inability to create it. And either way, God's power has boundaries, and omnipotence seems impossible. And this suggests that omnipotence might be an incoherent concept, might not be logically possible, might be like a square circle or a married bachelor, something that sounds meaningful but actually combines contradictory ideas and cannot exist. Theologians and philosophers have developed several responses to the paradox, attempting to show that omnipotence is coherent and that the paradox rests on misunderstandings or ambiguities. One common response is to restrict omnipotence to logically possible tasks, to say that God can do anything that is logically possible but cannot do things that are logically impossible, and creating a rock that an omnipotent being cannot lift is logically impossible, is self-contradictory, because omnipotence includes the ability to lift anything, and so a rock that cannot be lifted by an omnipotent being is a logical impossibility, like a square circle. And God's inability to create logical impossibilities does not limit God's power in any meaningful sense, because logical impossibilities are not real tasks, are not things that could be done. And so excluding them from the scope of omnipotence is not a limitation but a clarification. Visualize omnipotence as a set of powers: the power to create anything logically possible, the power to know anything knowable, the power to do anything doable. And the set does not include impossible things, does not include making square circles or creating married bachelors or lifting unliftable rocks. Because these are not tasks, are not possibilities, are just combinations of words that do not refer to any coherent state of affairs. And just as we do not think a mathematician is limited because they cannot prove that 2 + 2 = 5, we should not think God is limited because God cannot do logically impossible things, because these are not things, are not genuine constraints on power. Another response distinguishes between God's essential attributes and God's contingent choices, and argues that omnipotence means God has the power to do anything consistent with God's nature. And part of God's nature is being omnipotent, and so God cannot create a situation where God lacks omnipotence, because that would contradict God's nature. But this is not a limitation on God's power. It is a feature of what God is. And just as God cannot make God not exist, because God is a necessary being, God cannot make God not omnipotent, because omnipotence is essential to God. And the rock scenario asks God to create a contradiction, to remain omnipotent while becoming not omnipotent, and this is incoherent. And God's inability to do it reflects logical necessity, not weakness. A third response embraces the paradox and argues that it shows omnipotence is paradoxical, is not a coherent concept, and rather than defending omnipotence, we should acknowledge that God's power, while immense, is not literally unlimited, that there are things God cannot do, and this is not a defect in God but a recognition that power, like any concept, has logical limits. And some religious traditions, particularly in Eastern philosophy, are comfortable with divine paradoxes, with the idea that ultimate reality transcends logical categories, and the paradox of omnipotence is just one of many paradoxes that arise when finite human concepts are applied to the infinite divine. The paradox also appears in discussions of free will and divine foreknowledge, because if God knows the future infallibly, then God knows what choices humans will make. And if God knows what choices humans will make, then humans cannot choose otherwise, because if they could, then God's knowledge would be wrong. And so divine omniscience seems to eliminate human free will. And this creates a dilemma similar to the omnipotence paradox. Either God is not omniscient, does not know future free choices, or humans are not free, do not have genuine choice, and both options are unpalatable to many theologians who want to preserve both divine perfection and human freedom. And various solutions have been proposed, involving timeless knowledge, middle knowledge, open theism, but none has won universal acceptance, and the tension remains. The omnipotence paradox reveals that the concept of unlimited power is more complex than it first appears, that power operates within logical and conceptual constraints, and that saying God is all-powerful does not mean God can do literally anything we can describe in words, but only that God can do anything that is genuinely possible, anything that makes sense, and the paradox serves as a test case, forces clarification of what omnipotence means, pushes theologians to be precise about divine attributes, and shows that even the most basic theological claims require careful, philosophical analysis to be made coherent. God stands before the rock, or does not create the rock, and the paradox hangs in the air, a logical puzzle about power and limits, about possibility and coherence, and the answer depends on how omnipotence is defined, on whether logical impossibilities are excluded, on whether God's nature places constraints on divine action, and different traditions answer differently. Some saying God transcends logic, some saying logic constrains even God, and the omnipotence paradox remains, not fully resolved, still debated, still used to challenge and clarify theological concepts, and the rock sits there, hypothetical and impossible, a monument to the difficulties of thinking clearly about ultimate power, about infinite abilities, about what it means to say God can do anything. And the paradox persists, elegant and troubling, a reminder that even divine attributes, even the powers of an unlimited being, must answer to logic, must cohere, must make sense, and that the concept of omnipotence, for all its simplicity, conceals depths and difficulties that philosophy continues to explore. The origination paradox, why you cannot create yourself. A philosopher asks where free will comes from. What makes a choice truly free, truly yours? And the answer seems to require that you be the ultimate source of your choices, that your decisions originate with you rather than being caused by factors beyond your control. And this origination, this ultimate sourcehood, seems necessary for responsibility, because if your choices are caused by factors you did not create, by genes you did not choose, by environments you did not design, by prior causes that reach back before your birth, then how are you responsible for those choices? How are they truly yours? And yet origination seems impossible, seems to require that you create yourself, that you choose your own character before you have a character to make choices with. And this is the origination paradox, the problem that free will seems to require ultimate origination, ultimate sourcehood, being the first cause of your actions, but such origination is impossible, requires creating yourself from nothing, requires existing before you exist to make the choices that create you. And this impossibility suggests that free will, understood as requiring ultimate origination, is impossible, is an incoherent concept, and responsibility is problematic. And this paradox has driven many philosophers to conclude that free will, in the strong libertarian sense, does not exist, cannot exist, and the most we can have is a weaker compatibilist freedom that does not require ultimate origination. Imagine trying to be the ultimate source of your actions, trying to take complete responsibility for what you do, and you trace back the causes of your action. Your action was caused by your decision. Your decision was caused by your desires and beliefs. Your desires and beliefs were caused by your experiences and your innate psychology. Your innate psychology was caused by your genes and early development. Your genes were caused by your parents, and the causal chain extends back before your existence. And at no point in this chain did you create the causes. At no point did you originate the factors that shaped you. And so you are not the ultimate source of your actions. You are a link in a causal chain that extends beyond you. And if responsibility requires ultimate origination, then you are not responsible because you did not originate yourself, did not create the character from which your choices flow. The origination paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. To be ultimately responsible for an action, you must be ultimately responsible for how you are, for your character, your values, your psychology, because your action flows from how you are, and to be ultimately responsible for how you are. You must have chosen to be that way, but to choose to be a certain way, you must already have some character, some values, some psychology to make the choice with. And this prior character must itself have been chosen if you are to be ultimately responsible for it. And this leads to an infinite regress. You must have chosen your character. Before choosing your character, must have existed before you existed to create yourself. And this is impossible. And so ultimate responsibility, ultimate origination is impossible. And if free will requires it, then free will is impossible. Visualize the regress to be responsible for action. A, you must be responsible for character C that caused A, and to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for earlier character CE that caused C. And to be responsible for C, you must be responsible for even earlier character C, and so on infinitely. And the regress cannot be completed, cannot be grounded, because there is no first character that you chose, no original act of self-creation. And so the chain of responsibility has no beginning, hangs unsupported, and ultimate responsibility collapses. And with it collapses free will understood as requiring ultimate origination. This argument, developed by Galen Strawson and others, is meant to show that libertarian free will understood as requiring ultimate sourcehood, is impossible, is incoherent. And this drives the debate toward compatibilism, toward the view that free will does not require ultimate origination, but only requires that actions flow from the agent's own psychology, from their desires and values, even if those desires and values were themselves caused by factors beyond the agent's control. And compatibilism avoids the origination paradox by weakening the requirements for freedom, by denying that ultimate origination is necessary. One response to the origination paradox accepts it, accepts that ultimate responsibility is impossible, and embraces the conclusion that no one is truly responsible in the ultimate sense. And this view, sometimes called hard incompatibilism, denies both that we have libertarian free will and that compatibilist freedom is sufficient for genuine responsibility. And moral responsibility is an illusion, is a concept that cannot be sustained once we recognize the impossibility of ultimate origination, and we should replace responsibility with other concepts, with forward-looking considerations about consequences and prevention rather than backward-looking considerations about desert and blame. Another response argues that ultimate origination is not necessary for responsibility, that responsibility requires only proximate origination, being the proximate cause of action, the immediate source. And as long as your action flows from your own deliberation, your own character, you are responsible, even if your character was shaped by prior causes, even if you are not the ultimate source. And proximate origination is sufficient for the kind of responsibility that matters for ethics and law. And the origination paradox shows only that ultimate responsibility is impossible, not that ordinary responsibility is impossible, and we should not let the impossible standard of ultimate origination undermine the possible standard of proximate origination. A third response from agent causation theories argues that persons are uncaused causes, are agents who can initiate causal chains without being caused to initiate them. And agent causation is a special kind of causation, different from event causation, where events cause events and agents, as substances have the power to cause events without being caused to exercise that power. And this avoids the regress because the agent does not need to cause themselves, does not need prior character to act, but can act directly as an uncaused cause. and this preserves ultimate origination by making agents first causes. But critics argue that agent causation is mysterious, unexplained, involves a kind of causation that seems inconsistent with naturalism, seems like magic, and the theory creates more problems than it solves. The origination paradox also connects to debates about moral luck, about whether we can be responsible for factors beyond our control, because the paradox shows that if we trace back far enough, everything is beyond our control, everything is luck, is the product of factors we did not choose, and if we cannot be responsible for luck, then we cannot be responsible for anything. And this conclusion, while following from the paradox, seems too extreme, seems to eliminate responsibility entirely, and this drives some philosophers to accept moral luck, to accept that we can be responsible for actions that depend on factors beyond our control. That responsibility does not require eliminating luck, but only requires certain kinds of control, certain kinds of connection between agent and action. The philosopher asks where you came from, how you became the person you are, and the answer traces back through causes, through genes and upbringing and choices and experiences. And none of these origins were ultimately under your control. None were self-created, and so you are not self-caused, are not self-created, are not the ultimate origination of yourself. And if responsibility requires self-creation, then you are not responsible, and the origination paradox stands as a permanent challenge to libertarian theories of free will, shows that ultimate origination is impossible, shows that we cannot be the uncaused first causes of ourselves, and whether this impossibility undermines all responsibility or only ultimate responsibility remains contested, and the paradox persists, a challenge to the idea that we are truly the authors of our actions, truly the originators of our choices, and the causal chain extends back, and you stand in the middle, caused by the past, causing the future, and where you came from. Who created you? The answer is no one. You emerged from causes, were shaped by forces, and the origination was not yours, was nature's, was the universe's, and whether this makes you unfree, makes responsibility impossible, remains one of the deepest questions in philosophy of free will, and the origination paradox endures, impossible to solve, impossible to escape, a permanent reminder that self-creation is impossible, and ultimate origination is a fantasy, and what we are left with is proximate origination, being the immediate cause of actions, being the link through which causes flow, and whether this is enough for freedom remains the central question, and the paradox stands, stark and unavoidable, showing that we did not create ourselves, cannot create ourselves, and yet must live and choose and be responsible somehow. The ontological paradox, why existence itself is impossible. A philosopher asks the most fundamental question in metaphysics, asks why anything exists at all, why there is something rather than nothing, and this question seems to demand an answer. Seems like there must be some explanation for the existence of the universe, some reason why being triumphs over non-being, and yet every proposed answer creates problems, creates paradoxes, leads to infinite regress or unjustified stopping points. And this is the ontological paradox, the puzzle about existence itself, about whether existence requires explanation, whether existence can be explained, whether there could be a sufficient reason for there being something rather than nothing. And the paradox arises because existence seems to be a brute fact, seems to be something that just is without explanation, and yet accepting brute facts seems unsatisfying, seems to violate the principle of sufficient reason, the principle that everything has an explanation, and this tension between the demand for explanation and the impossibility of ultimate explanation creates the ontological paradox, a paradox that has troubled philosophers since ancient times, that remains unresolved, that perhaps cannot be resolved, and that reveals deep limits on human understanding, on our capacity to explain why things are rather than why they are not. Imagine trying to explain why the universe exists, why there is something rather than nothing, and you might say the universe exists because it was created, but then you must explain why the creator exists. And if you say the creator exists necessarily, exists by its own nature, cannot fail to exist, then you face the question of why necessary existence is possible, why there are any necessary beings, why the category of necessary existence is not empty. And if you say the creator has no explanation, exists as a brute fact, then you have abandoned the demand for explanation, have accepted that existence requires no reason. And if existence requires no reason, then why not say the universe itself exists as a brute fact? Why invoke a creator at all? And the explanatory chain either goes on forever, infinite regress, or stops at something unexplained. Brute fact, and neither option is satisfying. Neither provides the ultimate explanation we were seeking. And the ontological paradox emerges, the recognition that existence cannot be fully explained. That the question why something, rather than nothing, has no satisfactory answer. The paradox can be stated as an impossibility argument. Either everything has an explanation, or some things are brute facts without explanation. If everything has an explanation, then there must be an explanation for the totality of all facts, for why anything exists at all. And this explanation must appeal to something outside the totality, something that explains why the totality exists. But nothing is outside the totality. The totality includes everything. And so there can be no explanation for the totality. And so not everything has an explanation. And there are brute facts. And if there are brute facts, then the principle of sufficient reason is false. And we must accept that some things exist without reason, without explanation. And if existence requires no explanation, then the question, why something rather than nothing has no answer, is not a real question, is based on the false assumption that existence requires explanation. Visualize nothingness, absolute nothingness, no matter, no energy, no space, no time, no laws of nature, no mathematical structures, no abstract objects, nothing at all. And from this nothingness, something emerges. The universe comes into being. And the question is why? What caused this emergence? What explained this transition from nothing to something? And the problem is that causes and explanations presuppose existence, presuppose that there are things that can cause and explain. And absolute nothingness contains no causes, no explanations, nothing that could produce something. And so the emergence from nothing seems impossible, seems to violate principles of causation and explanation. And yet here we are. Existence is actual. Something exists. And this existence seems inexplicable, seems to be a brute fact that cannot be explained in terms of anything more fundamental, because there is nothing more fundamental than existence itself. One response to the ontological paradox accepts it, accepts that existence is a brute fact, that there is no explanation for why there is something rather than nothing, that the universe just exists without reason. And this response abandons the principle of sufficient reason, abandons the demand that everything be explained, and treats existence as the foundation, as the starting point beyond which explanation cannot go. And this response is common among atheist philosophers, among those who see the universe as all there is, as existing without creator or external explanation. And the ontological paradox is dissolved by rejecting one of its premises, by denying that existence requires explanation. Another response appeals to necessary existence, argues that something must exist, that nothingness is not a genuine possibility, that existence is necessary, and the question why something rather than nothing is based on the false assumption that nothing is a real alternative. And various arguments have been offered for necessary existence, arguments that nothingness is unstable, that something must arise from nothing due to quantum fluctuations or logical necessity, or arguments that necessary beings like God exist by their nature and cannot fail to exist. And these arguments attempt to show that existence is not contingent, not dependent on external factors, but is necessary, is unavoidable. And if existence is necessary, then the question why something rather than nothing dissolves. The answer is that something must exist. Nothing is not an option. A third response questions the question, argues that why is there something rather than nothing is not a genuine question, is based on confusion about what questions can meaningfully be asked. And the question presupposes that nothing is the default, the expected state, and something is the deviation that requires explanation. But this presupposition is unjustified. There is no reason to privilege nothing over something, no reason to think nothing is more natural or more likely. And if something and nothing are on equal footing, then the question collapses, becomes unanswerable because it has no presupposition to support it. And the ontological paradox dissolves because the founding question is revealed to be pseudo-question. The ontological paradox also connects to debates about cosmology, about the origin of the universe, about whether the Big Bang was the beginning of everything, or whether something existed before, and cosmologists have proposed various scenarios. Eternal inflation, where universes are constantly being created in a multiverse. Cyclic cosmologies, where the universe goes through endless cycles of expansion and contraction. Quantum creation, where the universe emerged from quantum vacuum fluctuations, and each scenario pushes the question back, explains our universe in terms of something more fundamental. But the question remains why that more fundamental thing exists, why there is quantum vacuum, why there are laws of physics, why there is anything at all. And the ontological paradox persists at every level, cannot be escaped by postulating more fundamental entities or processes. Some philosophers embrace the paradox, treat it as revealing something deep about the limits of explanation, about the structure of understanding. That explanation must stop somewhere, must reach a foundation that is itself unexplained. And existence is that foundation, is the basic fact that grounds all other facts. And accepting this involves accepting that not everything can be explained, that the demand for total explanation is impossible to satisfy, and the ontological paradox is not a problem to solve, but a limit to accept, a recognition that human understanding has boundaries, that some questions have no answers, and the question, why is there something rather than nothing, is such a question, is beyond our capacity to answer. And we must live with the mystery, with the brute fact of existence. The universe exists, spreads across billions of light years, contains galaxies and stars and planets and life. And the question echoes, why? Why does any of this exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? And no answer fully satisfies, no explanation reaches the ultimate ground. And the ontological paradox persists, ancient and insoluble. A paradox that reveals the limits of metaphysics, the boundaries of explanation, the point where philosophy must fall silent and accept that existence simply is, without reason, without cause, without ultimate explanation. And the paradox endures as one of the deepest problems in philosophy, a problem that perhaps cannot be solved because it points to the edge of what can be understood, the limit where explanation gives out and brute fact takes over, and existence remains, mysterious and fundamental, and the question remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable.